In 1873, a cattle drover named Clyde Barrow, outside Dodge City, fought off 3 armed men with nothing but a leather quirt and a skinning knife. No revolver, no rifle, just tools he carried every single day. Most people think the cowboy's only weapon was the Colt on his hip. They are dead wrong. The real cowboys carried an arsenal of forgotten fighting tools that modern survival experts are only now rediscovering. Number 18 on this list was banned in 5 territories because lawmen considered it more dangerous than a pistol. And number 3 uses a principle that the United States Marine Corps still teaches today. Before we start, subscribe, because this list might change how you think about self-defense forever. Let's count down. Number 25, the leather quirt. Every working cowboy carried a quirt, a short, braided leather riding whip about 18 inches long with a loaded handle. Most folks thought it was just for encouraging a lazy horse. It was not. The handle was weighted with a lead slug or a smooth river stone braided inside the leather, turning a simple riding tool into a devastating close-quarters weapon. A swing across the temple could drop a man cold. Drovers on the Chisholm Trail in the 1870s preferred quirts over knuckle fighting because they kept distance between you and the other man's fists. The braiding itself mattered. A tighter weave meant a stiffer strike. 8-plat rawhide was the standard, and a well-made quirt lasted a decade of daily use. Cowboys practiced wrist snaps the way boxers shadow punch, building speed until the tip moved faster than the eye could follow. Saloon fights ended before they started when a quirt cracked across someone's knuckles. Today, equestrian shops still sell quirts, but nobody remembers what that loaded handle was really designed to do. Number 24, the hobble strap. A hobble was a short leather strap used to bind a horse's front legs together so it could graze without wandering off. Simple enough. But trail hands discovered that a hobble doubled as a restraint, a flail, and a tourniquet. Wrap it around your fist, with the buckle end swinging free, and you had an improvised blackjack that left welts through a wool coat. During cattle drives through Indian Territory, night guards kept hobbles looped on their belts, not for horses, but for the 2-legged trouble that crept into camp after dark. The heavy brass buckle was the business end. One solid crack across the forearm, and whatever a man was holding hit the dirt. After the fight, that same strap could bind a wound tight enough to stop arterial bleeding. One single piece of leather served 5 purposes. Cowboys did not carry anything that only did one job. Number 23, the piggin string. A piggin string was a short length of rawhide cord, about 6 feet long, used to tie a calf's legs after roping. Every cowboy carried one looped on his saddle or tucked into his belt. In a survival situation, this thin cord became a garrote, a snare line, a shelter lashing, or a tripwire strung ankle-high across a trail. Ranch hands in West Texas during the 1880s used piggin strings to bind prisoners when no jail existed within 100 miles. It was slick when wet and shrank tight as it dried, making any knot nearly impossible to escape. A 6-foot length weighed almost nothing and took up less space than a bandana. Yet it could restrain a 200-pound man or snare a rabbit for supper. Modern paracord. Survival bracelets are trying to reinvent what cowboys solved 150 years ago with a strip of dried cowhide. Number 22, the belt knife. Not the Bowie knife, not the fancy sheath knife with a stag handle. The belt knife was a plain, thin-bladed tool about 4 inches long that cowboys wore horizontally across the small of the back. It was the knife you reached for when skinning, cutting rope, trimming a hoof, or opening a tin of peaches. In a fight, its small size was the advantage. A man could draw it without the wide, sweeping motion that a hip-mounted bowie demanded, and the thin blade slipped between ribs where a thick blade would catch on bone. Trail bosses on the goodnight-loving route insisted every hand carry one. Not for fighting, they said, for everything else. But everyone knew what everything else meant when the campfire went dark, and the coyotes were not the only things circling. A replacement blade cost 15 cents at any general store from San Antonio to Abilene. Disposable, reliable, and invisible under a vest. Number 21. The lariat as a weapon. A 60-foot hemp or rawhide lariat was the cowboy's most versatile tool, and every working hand could throw a loop accurate to 30 feet. But the lariat had a darker use. A hard-thrown loop around a man's neck or legs could unseat a rider or drag a man off his feet from horseback at a full gallop. Mexican vaqueros called this technique la reata, and American cowboys learned it crossing the Rio Grande. During range wars in Wyoming and Montana in the 1880s and the 1890s, lariats were used to pull men from barricades and drag rustlers behind horses as a warning. The rope itself was a weapon of reach. No knife or club could touch you from 30 feet away. Even today, competitive ropers can drop a loop over a moving target in under 2 seconds. That same skill, applied to a man instead of a steer, was terrifying in its precision. Number 20. The saddle ring carbine scabbard. Cowboys did not carry rifles in their hands. They carried them in leather scabbards strapped under the saddle fender, positioned for a cross draw so the rider could yank the carbine free without dismounting. The scabbard itself was hardened leather, boiled and shaped over wooden forms, stiff enough to use as a shield against a knife slash or a club swing. When the rifle was drawn, that empty scabbard became a blunt striking weapon, rigid as an oak plank and long enough to keep a man at arm's length. Riders in the Texas Rangers during the Comanche campaigns of the 1860s and the 1870s were trained to fight with whatever was in hand, and a stiff leather scabbard swung like a policeman's baton. It weighed about 2 pounds. That does not sound like much until it connects with your jaw. Number 19. The spur as a close-quarters tool. Spurs were not just for riding. In a ground fight, a cowboy's roweled spurs turned his boots into edged weapons. A kick with a steel rowel spinning at the heel could open a gash deep enough to need stitches. Saloon brawlers in Tombstone and Deadwood learned to aim spur kicks at the shins, thighs, and ankles, where the spinning rowel raked flesh like a miniature circular saw. Some men filed their rowel points sharper than they needed for any horse. Trail bosses looked the other way. A pair of hand-forged spurs cost about $2 in 1878 and lasted a lifetime. They announced your arrival with every step, which meant surprise attacks against a man wearing spurs were nearly impossible. That jingle was not decoration. It was an early warning system built into your boots. Number 18. The black snake whip. This is the one that got banned. A black snake was a 6 to 10 foot bullwhip made of braided leather without a stiff handle, designed to coil flat and ride in a saddlebag. Freighters and stagecoach drivers carried them for mule teams, but cowboys discovered that a black snake could disarm a man from 8 feet away. The tip moved at over 700 miles per hour, faster than the speed of sound. That crack you hear is a miniature sonic boom. A strike across the hand forced open any grip. A wrap around the ankle brought a man down hard. Territorial marshals in Kansas and Nebraska banned black snakes inside city limits during the 1870s because they considered them concealed weapons more dangerous than revolvers. A revolver needed ammunition. A black snake just needed a wrist. Teamsters laughed at the ban. They carried them anyway, calling them work tools. Nobody argued twice. First pattern break. Here is where things get serious. The tools from here forward are not just clever improvisations. They are purpose-built instruments that cowboys carried knowing full well what they were for. And number 12 involves a piece of equipment so common you have probably walked past one today without realizing it was designed to break bones. Number 17, the loaded quirt handle, heavy variant. We covered the standard quirt at number 25. This is different. Some cowboys, particularly those riding nighthawk, watch over sleeping herds, carried quirts with handles loaded, not with a single lead slug, but with a full 6 ounces of poured lead or buckshot sealed inside a leather-wrapped wooden core. This was not a riding crop. This was a sap disguised as one. Night guards in the Texas Panhandle during the 1880s faced threats from horse thieves, claim jumpers, and drifters who waited for the camp to sleep. A heavy quirt to the base of the skull ended the conversation before it started. No gunshot to stampede 2,000 head of longhorns, each worth $40. No muzzle flash to reveal your position. Just a quiet thud and a man on the ground. Ranchers issued these to trusted hands and pretended not to know what they were for. Number 16, the hoof pick. Every cowboy carried a hoof pick to clean stones and debris from a horse's hooves. It was a simple hook of forged iron, about 5 inches long with a pointed tip. In a grappling fight, that curved steel point became a devastating close-range weapon, capable of hooking flesh, raking across an arm, or puncturing through heavy canvas and leather. It rode in the saddlebag or a vest pocket, light enough to be forgotten until you needed it. Cowboys on remote line camps in Montana and Dakota Territory, miles from any law or help, kept a hoof pick in their boot top the way a city man keeps a pocket knife. It was never called a weapon. It was always called a tool. The distinction mattered in court if you ever got to one. A hot branding iron was an obvious deterrent. Nobody argued with a man holding a glowing steel rod. Even when cold, a branding iron could be a formidable weapon. 3 feet of solid iron rod with a heavy stamp head weighing 2 to 4 pounds made a club that could shatter bone on impact. During branding season, ranch hands kept irons propped against the corral fence within arm's reach. Rustlers who tried to alter brands in remote pastures often found themselves on the wrong end of the same tool. The long handle gave reach and leverage, and the heavy head delivered force concentrated on a small surface area. Physics made it devastating. A branding iron was not subtle, but subtlety was not what you needed when 3 men rode into your camp uninvited at midnight. A steel horseshoe weighed about 1 pound and fit perfectly inside a closed fist, with the toe sticking out between the knuckles. Cowboys called it a mule's kiss. One punch with a horseshoe-loaded fist hit with the force of a ball-peen hammer concentrated on a half-inch edge of hardened steel. Blacksmiths in every cattle town, from Abilene to Cheyenne, kept a bin of discarded shoes outside the forge. They were free. Cowboys picked through them for one that fit their grip, filed the edges smooth so it would not cut their own hand, and carried it in a coat pocket. In saloon fights where guns were checked at the door, a horseshoe in the fist was the great equalizer. No marshal ever arrested a man for carrying a horseshoe. What was the charge? Intent to shoe a horse aggressively. Number 13, the fence post driver. This heavy iron tube, open at both ends, was used to pound fence posts into hard prairie ground. It weighed about 15 pounds and could be swung like a medieval warhammer. Settlers and cowboys stringing barbed wire across the open range in the 1880s carried these on their wagons, and more than one range war dispute was settled with a post driver before anyone reached for a firearm. The weight made it slow, but a single overhead swing could crush a saddle or break a man's collarbone through a heavy coat. It was not a weapon of finesse. It was a weapon of finality. Number 12. The Singletree Club. A singletree was the wooden crossbar that attached a draft horse's harness traces to a wagon. Every wagon, buckboard, and stagecoach had at least two. Made from seasoned hickory or oak, about 30 inches long and slightly curved, it was essentially a purpose-built war club sitting in plain sight on every vehicle in the American West. When fights broke out at wagon camps or relay stations, the singletree came off its pin in 2 seconds flat. Hickory does not break. It flexes and springs back, delivering full force with every swing. Stagecoach drivers on the Butterfield Overland route kept a loose singletree under the box seat. Bandits expected a shotgun. They did not expect a 3-foot oak club swung by a man who spent 12 hours a day handling reins and building forearms like bridge cables. The singletree is the tool you have walked past 1,000 times in Western museums without knowing it was the most common improvised weapon on the frontier. Second pattern break. Now pay attention. The next 8 entries are where frontier survival knowledge meets modern science. These are not just historical curiosities. Every single one of these tools operates on a principle that modern self-defense instructors, military trainers, or survival experts still use today. Your great-great-grandfather figured it out with leather and iron. The Pentagon figured it out with research grants. Same answer, different century. Some lariats had a small lead or iron weight braided into the honda, the small loop at the business end of the rope. This was not standard. It was a modification made by cowboys who worked brush country in South Texas, where thick mesquite and chaparral made wide loops useless. The weighted honda could be thrown underhand like a bola, wrapping around legs or tangling in brush to anchor a rope. In a fight, swinging that weighted end overhead like a sling created a striking tool with a 3-foot reach that hit like a sock full of billiard balls. The weight also made the rope throw straighter in high wind, solving a practical problem with a tool that happened to double as a weapon. Cowboys called it a loaded honda, and they pretended it was just for roping in thick brush. Nobody believed them. Nobody cared. Number 10. The canteen strap flail. A full canteen on a leather strap became a swinging weapon with serious impact force. 2 pints of water weigh about 2 pounds. Add the tin canteen itself, and you had 3 pounds of mass at the end of a 3-foot leather strap. Cowboys swung loaded canteens in circular arcs that generated enough centrifugal force to dent a cast iron skillet. In desert country, where water was survival, the canteen never left your side, which meant you were never unarmed. Cavalry troopers in the Apache campaigns documented using canteens as flails when ammunition ran out during close engagements. The technique required nothing but instinct. Grab the strap, swing, connect. The same physics that makes a medieval ball and chain lethal makes a full canteen on a strap dangerous. The difference is that nobody looks twice at a man carrying a canteen. Number 9. The cinch ring. The cinch ring was a heavy iron or brass ring about 3 inches in diameter, used to fasten the saddle girth under a horse's belly. Slip one over your fingers, and you had a set of brass knuckles, custom fitted by a saddle maker. Cowboys removed spare cinch rings from old saddles and carried them in vest pockets across cattle country. In towns where marshals confiscated knives and pistols at the city limits, a cinch ring passed inspection every time. It was horse tack, nothing more. A punch thrown with a cinch ring over the knuckles concentrated force on a narrow band of metal and could fracture a cheekbone or crack an orbital socket with a single straight jab. Old saddles were scrapped for parts, and cinch rings traded hands in bunkhouses the way poker chips moved across the card table. Number 8. The picket pin. A picket pin was a heavy iron or steel stake about 14 inches long, driven into the ground with a rock or a boot heel to tether a horse on open prairie where no trees existed. Pulled from the ground and gripped at the flat end, it became a short iron spike, a stabbing and striking tool with reach, weight, and a hardened point. Night herders on the staked plains of West Texas carried picket pins on their belts because the flat grassland offered nothing else to use as a weapon if trouble rode in. 14 inches of solid iron in your hand changes the math of any confrontation. It was not elegant. It did not need to be. While the hemp lariat was common, the braided rawhide riata, favored by California and Southwest cowboys, had a unique property. Rawhide shrinks when it dries. A man bound with wet rawhide and left in the sun found himself trapped tighter with every passing hour. Vaqueros in the borderlands used this property to immobilize prisoners, splint broken limbs, and lash together emergency shelters that tightened into rigid structures as the desert air dried the leather. The same principle works in modern survival situations. Wet rawhide lashings on a splint will hold a broken bone more securely than most elastic bandages as they dry and contract. This is frontier engineering that orthopedic surgeons would recognize immediately. Number 6. The saddle horn cap. Some saddle horns were capped with a heavy brass or iron plate to protect the leather from rope burns during hard dallying. The cap could be unscrewed and gripped in the fist as a palm weight, turning an open hand strike into something that hit with the force of a carpenter's hammer. The cap weighed half a pound, was perfectly shaped to nest in the palm, and left no mark on the man carrying it. It was attached to the saddle, part of the equipment, invisible as a weapon. When removed and held tight, it transformed a slap into a knockout blow. Cowboys who worked heavy roping strings, handling big steers and bulls, kept their horn caps tight but easy to remove, just in case. Number 5. The stampede string garrote. A stampede string was a thin leather cord that ran from one side of a cowboy's hat brim under the chin and back up to the other side, keeping the hat on in high wind. Pulled free from the hat, it became a cord between 12 and 18 inches long, thin enough to cut into flesh under pressure. In desperate, close-quarters situations, a stampede string looped over an attacker's throat, with the cord crossing behind the neck, created a choking restraint that tightened with every pull. It was the last resort for a man who had lost every other tool. But it was always there, on your person, disguised as part of your hat. Modern military combatives programs teach improvised ligature techniques using bootlaces and paracord. Cowboys had the same tool sewn into their hat a century earlier. Number 4. The axle grease tin. This one is about survival, not fighting. Every wagon carried tins of axle grease to lubricate wheel hubs. That thick, tallow-based grease was also a wound sealant, a fire starter, a waterproofing agent, and an insect repellent. Smeared on a deep cut, it stopped bleeding and sealed dirt out. Smeared on canvas, it waterproofed a shelter in minutes. Mixed with dry grass and sparked with flint and steel, it caught fire even in soaking rain. Frontier doctors in army posts across the West documented using axle grease on wounds when proper medical supplies ran out. The tallow base was chemically similar to the lanolin-based wound dressings that would not be manufactured commercially for another 50 years. A 10-cent tin of grease could save your life in 6 different ways, and every cowboy had one within arm's reach on the wagon. Number 3, the sling and stone. Before you laugh, consider this. David did not choose a sling because he was primitive. He chose it because it was the most effective ranged weapon available to a man on foot. Cowboys and shepherds across the American West carried simple leather slings for killing rattlesnakes, driving off coyotes, and hunting small game without wasting expensive ammunition. A smooth river stone thrown from a leather sling by a skilled operator leaves the pouch at over 90 miles per hour. That is faster than a major league fastball. At 20 yards, a stone from a sling will crack a skull. The United States Marine Corps Survival Manual still lists the sling as a viable field expedient weapon, confirming what shepherds and cowboys knew since the 1840s. No ammunition cost, no mechanical failure, no sound to give away your position. It is silent. Just leather, cordage, and a stone from the creek bed. The oldest weapon in human history was still riding in saddlebags during the age of the Winchester. Number 2, the chaps as armor. Leather chaps were worn to protect legs from brush, thorns, and rope burns. But those heavy leather leggings also served as improvised armor in a knife fight. A slashing blade that would open a man's thigh through denim bounced off thick bullhide chaps without breaking the surface. Cowboys in brush country wore batwing or shotgun chaps that covered the leg from hip to ankle in a continuous shield of hardened leather. In close fights, men turned their hips toward the attacker, using the chap-covered leg as a shield, the way a medieval knight used a buckler. The leather was thick enough to stop a shallow knife thrust and tough enough to resist tearing. No cowboy called his chaps armor, but every cowboy who survived a knife fight in them knew exactly what they were. Number 1, the slungshot. The most devastating concealed weapon on the frontier was not a gun. It was a slungshot, a leather pouch filled with lead shot or a heavy iron ball attached to a short leather strap or spring handle, small enough to fit in a coat pocket, light enough to forget you were carrying it, and powerful enough to kill a man with a single blow to the head. Cowboys, teamsters, miners, and gamblers carried slungshots across the West from the 1850s through the early 1900s. They were sold openly in general stores for about 50 cents. Lawmen confiscated them by the hundreds, and territorial legislatures banned them alongside brass knuckles and Bowie knives. But the bans never stuck because a slungshot looked like nothing, a leather pouch and a strap. It could be a tobacco bag. It could be a coin purse. It could be the last thing you ever saw. The physics are simple. A dense mass on a flexible handle multiplies the force of a swing by concentrating all that energy on a surface area the size of a silver dollar. Modern law enforcement impact weapons, the collapsible baton, the sap glove, and the blackjack are all descendants of the slungshot that cowboys carried in their vest pockets while the Colt gathered dust in the saddlebag. Here is the truth nobody teaches in history class. The revolver was expensive, heavy, inaccurate beyond 15 yards, and fired 6 shots that cost money every time you pulled the trigger. The real cowboy carried 20 weapons that cost nothing, weighed almost nothing, and never ran out of ammunition. Every tool on this list was something a working man already owned: a strap, a rope, a stone, a piece of iron. The frontier did not make men dangerous, it made them resourceful. Resourcefulness is the one survival skill that never goes out of style. Try carrying a horseshoe in your glove box. Keep a length of paracord on your belt. Learn to throw a rope with accuracy, because the cowboys who survived the frontier did not survive because they were the fastest draw. They survived because they understood that everything around them was a weapon if they knew how to use it. Share which tool surprised you most in the comments. And if your grandfather carried any of these, tell that story. Those stories are disappearing faster than the tools themselves.